Now, so very quickly, just for as a quick quiz, only a few questions. Please put them in the chat. Okay. Which task should be approximately 150 to 200 words? Okay, very good. Task 1, yes. If you are writing more than 200 words, it's fine, but you're wasting time. Okay, so aim for 100 to 200 words. All right. Next question. Which task is worth more? That's right. Task 2, it is worth a lot more, approximately double. How long for both tasks? That's it. Yeah, of course, 60 minutes or 1 hour. For task 1, 20 minutes, and task 2, 40. Okay. Is spelling important? Yes, it's very important. Yes. Unfortunately, those who do the computer-based test, there is no spell check. Which task should you not give your opinion? That's right. Very good. Task 1. That's great. So let's get on. So obviously, lots of the graphs that you're going to possibly get are obviously the line graph, the bar chart, the pie chart, and the table. These are very common. All these tasks are quite common, so you never can predict what you will get. We have the mixed graph, we have the process, and the map. Okay, so we're going to go through some of these very briefly. Many of you will be taking your tests soon, so hopefully this will be a kind of review if you've done lots of studying for the IELTS for task 1 and task 2. So the good news for task 1 is you only need a certain amount of language. Obviously, a language of change with dates and trends, compare and contrast with all tasks, process, staging, active and passive. We'll go through that a little bit later, and directional language. So compass points and positioning, which can also help you for listening part 2. Now, so some key points for task 1. Obviously, aim to do it in 20 minutes. Task 2 writing is worth double, so do that one first. Now, I always recommend to do task 2 first. You don't have to. But remember, if it's worth more, try to do that first. If you're not quite finished in 40 minutes, go to task 1, make sure you've got that completed, and then go back as well. So the bodies of task 2 are quite important, of course. The conclusion is important, but if you're aiming high, you must finish all. But remember, you've got to make sure that you have enough words in both. The good news for those doing it on the computer is you have a word count. If you're doing the written-based test, count how many you've got across, like 10, and then count 16 lines for task 1, if you get time. Okay, because if you don't have enough, you can lose points. Now, remember, task 1 is still important. Okay, so remember, if you do very well in task 2, but you don't do so well in task 1, it can bring you down. quite significantly. So try to aim to finish task 1 as well. If you only have, say, 20 words in task 1, then it can be a very low score. So make sure that you try to get those 150 words in. Okay. Next. Now, for task 1, every task must have a clear overview. Otherwise, you cannot score over a 5 for task achievement. All components must be mentioned. So if there's a lot of different countries, mention them all. However, if there's only if the country doesn't produce much, for example, only mention them very briefly. Obviously, 150 words or more. Wrong data can reduce your score to a 5.0 or lower. So make sure that your data is correct. All right. So for an 8, if you're aiming high, key features are skillfully selected and presented. Okay, make sure it's clear, skilled, appropriate overview. Okay. For a 7, key features, but more could be fully illustrated or extended. A clear overview. Make sure that the overview is very clear. Okay, we'll cover overviews shortly. Okay, make sure that the appropriate format is used, meaning making sure that, you've got a nice clear, gaps between the intro with the overview, or overview can be separate, then the bodies as well. Making sure that you use the right kind of language for that. Key features are adequate, and some details may be missing for a 6. So doesn't mean the categories, but make sure maybe some of the data. For a 5, no overview. So make sure that you remember the overview. You can put the overview in the bottom. However, I don't recommend it, and put the overview just under the introduction. Okay. So for task achievement, summarize the information, select and highlight key features, make comparisons, organize your response logically, accurate information, to kind of summarize that. Okay. Now, obviously, it's got to be, you've got to have a good coherence and cohesion. Basically, it means having a logical flow, easy to read. The examiners want to read it as quickly and easily as possible. Don't try to confuse them. It's got to be well linked, but try not to overlink as well. Use reference. We'll cover that a little bit later as well, instead of repeated phrases. Okay, for the lexical resource, using a variety of vocabulary, less common words related to the task. Okay, so not trying to use phrases you don't know the meaning of. Avoid vague language, tends to, seems to. I see a lot of this in writing, apparently, as well. So stay away from those. Obviously, avoid spelling mistakes and stay away from those opinions. It's okay if you mention we can see, but it can be seen. So try to stay away from any kind of personal pronouns. Now, here is an example. This is taken from Pauline Cullen. I'll give you a link to that later. So she highlights that these are some of the phrases or some of the collocations that will reduce your score. Okay, demonstrates. So that's more like showing something in another way. So try to stay, illustrates, etc. You can see some of these are actually wrong, okay? So try not to just try and use your best vocabulary because they might be inappropriate. Instead, just simply describe the graph, okay? If you want to look at this in detail, obviously it's recorded. You will be able to review some of these slides later. So grammatical range and accuracy, obviously a wide range of structures. I will show you some of those a bit later. Avoid grammatical errors. Punctuation is clear, especially for those writing on the paper test. Make sure that your full stops and commas are clear because it might affect your coherence. For a high score, make sure that your articles are correct. Okay. Here are some simple sentences. Once again, you can review this later. I will not read all the way through. So some simple sentences that you might want to practice. There we go. And more importantly, some of the complex ones. Now, this number 5 is a very good one to use if you are running out of time. So the number of cars declined slightly in 2001, remaining constant, or which remained constant in the next 5 years, growing slightly in 2008 and leveling out. Okay, so this is a very good one if you're running out of time, but remember, just to remember the word count is still important. Okay. Now we get to the overview. So highlight the most striking features. You don't need to write too much. Overall is a very good one. It shows the examiner that you had that overall in there. If you're concerned about a lack of words, then the most striking feature of the graph is, okay, or the chart. Now, this is an example here. And so we've got to identify the overall for this, obviously with the line graph. Now, a very good way to do that is to think about it in this kind of, think about what's at the beginning and it's at the end. Okay, so think about highlighting the, and see the kind of degree of change that is there. So for example, like this. So we just think about the beginning and the end for the overview. We could add a little bit extra as well, but remember, no data in the overview, no percentages. Here is an example. So the line graph compares the production of energy from coal in 4 European countries over a 15-year period between 1995 and 2010. Overall, the percentage of energy produced from coal declined in 4 countries in the time frame, but with Denmark dropping the most and Germany making a slight recovery in the last 3 years. So you can see there's no actual data. The data will be used in the body. Remember the overview, if you forget to do the overview in the beginning, it can be separate from the introduction and it can be placed at the bottom. But I recommend to do it after the introduction because it reminds you that it is important. Now, one thing I see quite often in writing is many people explaining up to this point and using this as one paragraph and this as another. Remember, the examiner wants to read it in the easiest way possible. So instead of doing it in 2 halves, simply describe the details over the whole length of time. It makes it a lot easier. Remember that many, especially in line graphs, many of the trends are very similar, like this. Okay, so that should be one paragraph, and that should be the second paragraph. Okay, you can do it like this, but I don't recommend it because the examiner wants to follow it through. As I'm reading any kind of writing, I have to keep going backwards and forwards. It takes a long time, and you may become a little bit confused as well. Okay, here's just an example. Obviously, I'm not going to read this out, but just notice the comparative languages, the trends, and the time frames as well. Okay, so nice clear gaps between each paragraph as well, and logically organizing, all right, instead of half and half. Now, the bar charts, you can see there is no time frame, so we need to make sure that we compare. And once again, organization is important. So think about what they are, like cooking, cleaning the house, washing up. These are chores. And you notice that in this, women do most chores, which is not very nice. Okay, the men tend to do more leisurely things. So once again, that's important for organization. And if you look at here, we can see with regard to household chores and turning to leisure activities, we're using comparative language, more than double. Here, spent nearly 3 times more time than women surfing the internet. So making sure that we use this kind of language as well as the number of hours or the percentage if it is. And we can see here a nice clear overview as well. Okay. Pie charts. Okay. So be careful about these, because be careful with language. This increased rapidly on this. So careful about those. Use fractions, but not just fractions as well. Okay. Remember, it is over time. And we're just describing between these. A good way to do it is to organize, is to see what that went down in one paragraph, or what went up in the other paragraph. Or we can do it from the biggest amounts or the biggest proportions, and then a separate one for the less change. Okay, there's an example again. So we've got here just over a quarter to 1/5. And you can see to only 14% here at 25, up slightly. So you can see there's a balance between fractions and also different percentages. Something a little bit more, I would change this at nearly 12%, so approximations. We cover that again a little bit later. Now, so this is getting you a little bit more involved. So in percentages, what is 1/5? You can put the answers in the chat. Okay. So, okay, yeah, very good. Okay, 20% indeed. 1 in 20, everybody? 5 seconds. 5%. Okay. A quarter, how many percentage is a quarter? Yeah, there we go. 1 in 10. That's it. 3/5. 60%. Okay, half. Very good. 4/5. Yep, very good. 3/4. Excellent. And 2/5. Yeah, there we go. But remember that for many of these, they will not be exactly 20%, say 25%. So instead, we need to use approximations. So for this time, think about what the percentage is and where does it match on here. So, for example, 49% is which one on the left side? Okay, that's it, nearly a half. Very good. 5% for the quick typers. That's it, very good. A very small number. 27%. Uh, 27%? No, for this one. Yes, just over a quarter. 90%? 97, sorry. Almost all, very good. 85. That's it, very good. A very large majority. 58. That's it, approximately 60. You should always write approximately as well instead of approx, but this is good for here. 32. Almost at a third, that's right. 77. Yeah, just over 3/4. 68. Not quite there. Someone mentioned it earlier. Okay, around 2/3. And last one, 18. That's it, nearly a fifth. Excellent. Okay, so when we look at the tables, remember that some of these tables, okay, this table is very simple, is exactly the same as this line graph. Okay, so we approach it in the same way. So seeing about how it is over time. Likewise, for bar charts like this, we simply think about how this particular percentage here, okay, is very similar to, well, it's exactly the same as this. Okay, so 53, 63, etc. So we treat it in the same way, just using comparisons. If you can see, if you get this, we've got to mention each of these locations, and we need to mention at least once domestic, agricultural, and industrial. Okay, highlighting, obviously, the main parts in each category here. An example for this is turning first to Kuwait and Bahrain. Kuwait had the highest use of water at 63%. In contrast, the remaining 4 countries use much more water for agriculture. Once again, each country is mentioned at least once. And remember, you can have more than one paragraph, two paragraphs, etc. Finally, all 6 countries used very low amounts for industrial purposes, all under 8%. The only exception is Kuwait, just under 20%. So when we look again here, so when these numbers are very low, we only need to mention very briefly. Okay. Now, so some of the language we need for this, remember, if it's a table over time, use a language of change. However, be careful about some of the phrases, like slowly, gradually, unless it goes beyond 2 years. Use fractions or qualifiers as well, approximations. Yeah, so a good variation of vocabulary there. If it is a table over time, it can be analyzed as a line graph. Okay. Once again, grouping is very important. You don't need to write every single detail, but you need to be able to summarize. And remember, to mention each category, even if it's briefly. Okay, just as I mentioned there. Okay, if you get a mixed graph, this comes up quite a lot. And remember, with these, this basically means you've got to summarize even in a briefer way as well. But there's a big difference in this, and you need to paraphrase the task for both of them. So the line graph illustrates and the bar chart measures. And also you need to make sure that you have an overview for both of them. Okay. So you can see here the publication rates of males remain more or less stable, whereas those females increase significantly. It can also be seen. So going back there, you can see that this one warrants very little. Okay. For this one, we can see this is the most important part, but we do need to mention these briefly. An example for those, okay, are, a sec, there we are. So you can see in this part, there's only like 2 lines, okay, 2 sentences, complex sentences put together. Okay, you can see in the bottom graph, Sheffield, York, and Birmingham, they all produce less than 45. Overall, Birmingham produced the least. So for the second one, Warwick is the most important part, but the rest are mentioned briefly. So you can see for these. Okay, so a mixed graph. So when we think about those, compare and contrast language of change again. However, be careful, as many times one graph might only have one date, as the above demonstrates. Now, you need a longer overview and you need to describe both graphs. The good news is you can describe one graph and then the other, right? Which saves, it's easy to organize. But be careful, do not describe graphs when they are two different graphs with different headings. Okay. So just to go back to that very briefly, these would have different headings for both of those. Okay. Okay. When we move to the process on here, for this one, we use slightly different language. We still need an overview as all task ones. Think about the stages as well. Okay, make sure you give an overview of the complete process. And remember that some things do change. So if they're from leaves, they do become something else like tea later. And you've got to really kind of highlight that. These are some of the linking first, following this afterwards. And now, because this is a man-made process, then you can see on this, we used the passive. Now, so process language, man-made process, use the passive tense, okay? Natural processes, we can use the active tense. And remember to stay in, you can stay in the passive all the time for a man-made process, and for a natural, you can stay in the active. You don't need to mix them up. Okay. This is an example of an introduction for one. The diagram illustrates the procedure in which bricks are made for the building industry. Overall, the production of bricks undergoes a rather complex process, which comprises of 7 stages, starting with excavation of clay and culminating in delivery. So just simply mention the first part here, and then the last part here, and how many stages. Okay. Okay, now to the map. So for this particular one, I would recommend making a compass like this. Also, think about on the right side of the map, on the left side of the map as well. So draw this to remind you to mention those. Okay. Once again, the map is quite complicated sometimes, but we do not need to mention everything. Organization is very important for this as well. So we could organize it with all the details on the east side for the first paragraph, comparing the 2 different dates, and then on the west side. We could also think about the bigger changes as well. So you can see there's more industry on the east side, and on the you can see there's more accommodation on the west side. Okay, there's an example. I won't read it out this time, but you can see from this the most noticeable change, many green areas with other infrastructure projects. Okay, and accommodation in the west side of town. Once again, for this, in the south, over the river, east of the town, west of the location. Okay. There are obviously lots of these kind of phrases as well. Obviously, you won't be able to use all of them, but 1 or 2 of them would be very good. And likewise, mix these kind of prepositional phrases with points on the compass as well. Okay, so just to make sure that all your language is varied. Okay, now for each, as a kind of summary for these particular graphs, remember to kind of review a language should change and trends, compare and contrast, and the process. For the map, you should be aware of the compass points and positional language. Don't forget, these are these types of usage are frequently in listening, part 2 or section 2. Okay. So from those, let's go into a little bit of the language or the grammar for here. Remember some of the past tenses you might need. Always highlight as well. Okay, we can use the past perfect, present perfect, and some graphs go in the future. So if it is in the future, what I would generally recommend is to draw a line to now, and then describe it once again. Describe them all the way to the end. Okay, so these two would be described together, and this would have its own separate paragraph. Okay, that's the easiest way to organize it. Okay, remember to paraphrase the task. You don't need to remember. If it says shows, you can say illustrates or outlines. Okay, from that, the quantity, the information, genders. Once again, during the 10-year period from 1990 to 2000 is slightly longer. Okay. Some of the phrases. So introducing the set data. Okay. Beginning with introducing the second, meanwhile. Make sure that each paragraph is very clear to read in. Remember, leave a gap between the paragraphs. It's a lot easier and clearer for the examiner to mark. Okay. So, introduce the first trends and some of the exceptions for that as well. Okay. So you can see here the first result worth pointing out is that we've got quite a few words there. So remember, maybe some of these longer phrases will help you get to your 150 word mark and above. Okay. So many of you who've been studying, you should be familiar with these kind of phrases when you go and do the test soon. Remember, these are good phrases here: a two-fold rise, four-fold rise, quadruple. These are stronger ones of the escalate, soar, any of these. We're going to have a little practice of this in a minute. Likewise with down, from these, halve, slump, plummet, stronger ones there. Obviously, remember you need your tenses on those as well for the verbs. Okay. And for some of the middle ones, we don't need to remember stabilize at, level off at as well. Okay. Fluctuation, so you'll all be familiar with those as well. To fluctuate, a fluctuation. Now, something I want to highlight. Remember that a peak is like a mountain. Okay, reach a peak, a high point of, hit a peak of, and to peak at. Remember, peak at is a verb phrase. A peak of is a noun phrase. Okay, this is not necessarily a peak. It finishes at a high, at its highest point. Okay, remember a peak should go down like that. Once again, going the other way, hits its lowest point of, dipped on here as well. So remember those. And so one thing that I generally find when I'm marking, the mix between adjective and adverbs. So be careful about those as well, because yeah, don't forget that adverbs are a little bit more flexible, adjectives before the main noun. Okay, and we've got the very extensive change, average, and a small change as well. You don't need to remember every single one of them, of course, but just try to use them, try to vary some of them. Now, so this is getting you a little bit more involved just for a few minutes. Once again, in the chat, simply which ones, there's more than one, which ones are good for this particular trend? Excellent. Yeah. So number 2 is the best one. Okay. Yeah. So customer numbers fluctuated slightly or slightly fluctuated. We can also talk about fluctuation in numbers. Number 4 is okay. Yeah, that's fine. But once again, 2 is better for that one. Very quickly to the next one. Okay, some of you mentioned 4, not necessarily for this one. So number 3, numbers fell steadily. That's it. Number 2 is okay, but once again, number 3 is better. You'll see the difference between that and another very shortly. What about this one? Yeah, number 2, that's right. That's very good, yes. There we are. Number 4 is okay as well. Yeah. Some of you mentioned 3. It was downward trend, but it doesn't really mention the... doesn't really mention that, okay? But we can use, someone just mentioned wildly. We can say erratically or erratic, is fine. Wildly is fine, should be fine. Okay, for this one, what number? Number 3, that's right. Number 3 is fine. And number 2. Number 2 is fine. That's it, 2 and 3. For the next one. That's it. Customer numbers plunged. That's it, yeah. So you can see the difference between the one before, where it was quite gradual. For this one, it's obviously a lot stronger. So plunged is a better one for that. And this one. Yeah, so 1 and 3. But once again, we've got the adjective on here, a slight dip. So obviously this is a lot better. Yeah. So yeah, so customer numbers dipped is fine, but number 1 is better for that. Okay, good. Now, just remember some of the verbs to describe trends. From and to, with the prepositions of by here as well. Okay, and then nouns. So you see the difference. So prepositions are quite important because they can change. They can change the meaning, and that could result in some of your data being slightly confusing as well. So be careful with prepositions. So remember, when it doesn't change, it started at, peaked at, or a peak of, okay? Reaching, finishing at. We've got our fluctuation between and. The percentage fluctuated around that particular number as well. Okay. So once again, just a little bit of interaction here. So let's go through these very quickly. I'm not going to give you too long. So what's the first one? What preposition do we use? Okay. So for this one, to. But yeah, it depends on the context. It could be by if it was another number before, but 2 is a better one for that. Now, what about this one? Remain constant. Yeah, very good. At. So we see that when it remains constant. Next one, profits increased. Yep, from to. Excellent. Next one. Okay. Number 4. Okay. Yeah, by. Once again, someone mentioned to. Once again, it depends on its context, but usually by for that. Next one, number 5. A peak. Oh yeah, some of you fell for it. Yeah, a peak of. Remember, by itself, peaked at, if it was a verb, reached a peak of when it's a noun phrase. Okay. With the next one, number 6. At would be okay, but with for this one. Okay. So with nearly 3,000 cars traveling on the road. Okay. At nearly would work as well. Number 7. Okay, very good. A steep increase in. Another little clue here. Number 8, company stood. Yeah, you see, stood at. Excellent. For the next one, number 9. Yeah, between. Very good. And last one fell. There we go. Excellent. There we go. So make sure your prepositions are correct. Yep, there we go. Now, remember with the language of amounts. So for this, the number of and many with countable nouns, uncountable, amount of, and much. Be careful with much as well. It's usually used in the negative. Now, instead of saying the number of many, many, many times or the amount of, we can use these as kind of synonyms, okay? The proportion, the percentage. Be careful of rate. Remember, rate is to do with speed, but it should be fine for some. The quantity, the figure, and the data. So these are good ones to use. So use these as kind of synonyms. Okay, and reference language as well. Okay, so we got to think about these. These come up quite a lot. And instead of repetition, we can use reference language. So what do we have for the first one? Which one of these do we have? Can we use? Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, did so. So whereas instead of using repetition, where I went to the cinema in there, more than half said they did so in that particular next year, okay, or the next decade. Now, what about the next one? Not quite for that one. Okay, an admission charge, this or that should both work. Okay, yeah, there we go. Next one. In that order. Yes. Okay, very good. In that order. So that's right. So 24% for plays, 22% for art galleries, respectively. Try not to overuse. I would recommend just 2 times. We could also use in that order or correspondingly as well, but be careful how you use it, like the example from earlier. So it's got to be used correctly. For this one, I've arranged for this, the excursion to Stratford upon Avon. So what would... Okay, excellent. Former the latter, that's very good. For this one, that's it. These, okay. Visitors, that's right. And the last one is obviously to do with one. Okay, there we go. So think about your referencing language as well. Okay, so we also have approximation as well. We need to think about not just using exact numbers all the time. Okay, so for example here, last year, just over 90,000 mobile phones were sold in Italy. Just under 15% of people surveyed. The company will be spending just under 2 million euros on this technology, and it will cost just under $4 to produce this item. So approximations. Okay, very briefly on compare and contrast language. Many of you should know this as well. So I'm not going to read them through, but remember some of the transitions, some contrasting, on the other hand, some similarities, likewise, etc. It's just simply to highlight them. We also have here, so having the adverbial, remember we should be having, we should be making sure that we have kind of complex sentences. So whereas or while the UAE produces high levels of gas, and remember not to use any linker there. Japan produces more. Okay, so this becomes a dependent clause. Okay. And some of the other structures, once again, you can look at this later or just try to remember. More or less resilient than, as effective as, twice as much, or half the amount of, slightly more, both the same and equal. Okay, so now we've got a little 5-minute question time on task 1. Obviously, task 1 takes a lot longer. So please put your questions into in the question and answers. So I've got some already. Now, is it true that a candidate would receive a band 4 if he incorrect data? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, if it's the incorrect data, it could be around a 5 or even less. All right, so be careful about that under task achievement. How do you know which ones are the key features? Pretty much, as long as you remember, each category should be mentioned and just highlight, like in the, if it's a peak in the line graph, just make sure that you highlight it. All you're doing is describing the trends, if it is over time, and make sure that you answer those and just highlight enough from each to reach the 150 words. Remember, if there's not a lot of change, if the trend remains stable, for example, then just briefly mention it. So just see identify the main key features for that. Okay, I just need some water. Okay, so if the timeline of the graph covers a large period of time, such as from 1950 to 2050, what tense should I use in the overview? Okay, so what I would recommend for the overview is simply say from 1950, great changes or dramatic rise from 1950 to 2020, then we can use the present perfect. Since then, it has continued to decline and in the future, and will continue to climb in the future. Okay, so that's one way to do that for the overview. Once again, if it's most graphs are in the past, so we use that as well. Actually, don't forget, if there's no time frame, we can use the present tense. All right. But remember, try not to mix them up. So, yeah, I would say if there's no time frame, use the present tense for that. Okay. If there are two pie charts with different years, either, okay, compare each section with different years, or should I sections? That's up to you. You need to organize. You can do it by the two different years. Okay, but be careful, because remember, you need to be able to compare. You should be using compare and contrast language. And for that, you should be comparing across graphs if they are the same headings. Okay. So in that way, make sure that, yeah, that's the best way. But if you compare the first part and the pie chart, make sure there's lots of comparisons in the second pie chart with the first. Okay. Do you have any notes about the unit? I'm not sure if I understand that question, I'm afraid. Should we spend time writing task 2 before task 1? Yes. So as I said briefly at the beginning, I would recommend writing task 2 first. If you are a slow writer, I would generally try to have a very short introduction, both bodies. And if you're around 40 minutes, go and do task 1 second, and finish task 1, and then jump back to task 2 and finish the conclusion. Please spend some time reading the question and checking your answers as well. Okay. Now, what are the differences between band 8 and 7 in task 1? Okay, now you can look online. There is a public descriptor. You can find that quite easily. And the descriptors have changed recently. So just look up in Google and say task 1, task 2, IELTS descriptors. And you can look and analyze those as well. Okay. I did cover that a little bit earlier at the beginning. Okay, just 2 or 3 more questions. There will be more time at the end of the presentation because task 2 is a bit quicker. But once again, I would like some time for some questions. So just a couple more. So in marking criteria, we talk about progression. So that's a bit like the flow, the coherence. So making sure that the progression is a kind of natural descriptor. That's why you should also think about, if you're in task 1, describe the whole trend instead of 2 halves. Okay. Will the slides of the presentation sent to registered? You need to ask them, but don't forget that this will be available on several platforms. Okay. Okay. So no more questions just yet, but let's think about the last question here. So is there a difference in language between line graph, table? Yeah. So at the beginning, remember that all should use compare and contrast language for all tasks. You need a language change when there is a time frames. You've got the process language and obviously the map and directional language for that. Okay, let's move on to task 2. Okay, so let's have a quick drink. Now, for the key points here, this is very important. Answer all parts of the task with a clear position, arguing, discussing your idea. Write in a clear, formal style. Don't forget, it's not academic. We don't need references, so don't only use passives. Okay, so, you know, we can use some passives, of course, but don't just stay in passives. Okay, it does need to be formal, but IELTS task 2 is semi-formal to formal style, but not totally formal, like referencing, etc. You should only use vocabulary you know. Trying to use high-level grammar and vocabulary can confuse. Vary your grammar and language as well. Okay, do not use online templates and do not believe 9.0s online, some of these. Okay, so remember, 9.0, lots of these sites try to get you to the sites and promise you a 9.0. Remember, IELTS is being about precise, it's having the language, and it's being able to write that clearly. Obviously, we need 250 words as well for task 2. Now, for an 8, a clear, well-developed position. Ideas are relevant, well extended, and supported. Well, there's our extension as well. So making sure that we have a nice, clear, you know, body paragraphs, not just listing. We've got to extend them, give examples. Now, this is also from Pauline Cullen. She has very clearly highlighted this. Now, lots of people get stuck at a band 6. And she has a video even saying about, you know, native speaker writers even doing exactly the same thing. Okay, so to get a band 7, you need to make sure that all parts of the task are addressed. It's got to be clear, it's got to be extended, and supports. And this part is very important. I'll cover this again. There may be a bit of tendency to overgeneralize. We'll come back to that as a kind of explanation of that later. Okay. Now, obviously, you need to plan your writing. You need to critically think. All right. Otherwise, you will not score a 7.0 in task 2. Okay. Now, this should be highlighted. Now, for a 5.0 in task response, the main parts of the prompt are incompletely addressed. Now, what this basically means is if you see some keywords in the task and you completely write, you see like health, and then you talk about the pros and cons of staying healthy, but then it's, for example, talking about how gyms can improve health, then you've completely not addressed the task. Okay, the format may be inappropriate in places, and the writer expresses a position, but it's not always clear. Okay, some of the cohesion and coherence again, or vice versa, very similar to task 1. You still need clear progression. The idea's got to be arranged well, and organization for that. Okay, lots of repetition instead of using referencing words. Okay, so be careful about those. Once again, when we talk about organization, making sure that paragraphs are clear and make sure that they are separated as well. One thing I also say, if you're not very confident at writing, then use a topic sentence. That will help the examiner identify that, the main idea. Now, some of the lexical resource. So we've got here for that. Be careful about using idiomatic items. Okay. Only you can, there are, for example, things like state of the art. You know, these are kind of, it's obviously an adjective phrase, slightly idiomatic, but it doesn't mean like saying once in a blue moon. We shouldn't use that even in speaking. All right. So we've got to be a little bit careful about our word choice and collocations. So awareness of style. So that's the key part on this. Remember, it's a kind of formal, and collocation is evident. Some slips as well. But the key point I want to highlight here for a 6, you can have some errors, but these do not impede communication. So basically, it's easy to read. For 5, may cause some difficulty for readers. So just really highlight those, you know. So that's why it's important to read through once you've completed it, especially your paragraphs. You don't have to read everything, but really read through, if you get a chance, your paragraphs again. If you're on a computer-based test, it's quite easy to change. Okay, don't forget you're using a pencil and you will have a rubber or an eraser. There we are. Okay, so some of my ideas about semi-formal to formal style. Try not to use any contractions like this. Cannot is one word. All right, so stay away from that. These kind of contractions in both tasks, of course. Once again, wonderful, fantastic, terrible, great. All right, so be careful of these. It's too opinionated. Attractive prospect and negative outcome extremely beneficial. Sometimes when I'm marking, I see questions. We don't write them. Remember, you're answering a question, not creating one. There we are. So go straight in and answer the question. So, fanboys, in a formal kind of essay, then not an academic, but in a formal one, then stay away from fanboys at the beginning. Some examiners are a bit stricter maybe than others. You're graded, but there are some, there are some examiners are a bit stricter. Yeah, so some subjectiveness, that's what I was trying to think of. So because furthermore, so link them in a kind of slightly more formal way. Yeah, it's okay to use pronouns, personal pronouns. If you're asking, if you're given an opinion essay, if you're asked for to give your opinion, make sure that your opinion is clear. And you can say, for example, I believe or I strongly believe this. It's fine. But try not to overuse them as well. I noticed that when people write the word you, it's too informal and it just keeps going and then it's repeated. If you do this, and then you will do that. Okay? Instead, put it in the third person. Given your opinion, it's fine to use personal pronouns, but stay away from words like you because it becomes very repetitive. That's my personal advice for that. So, never and always is not recommended. Very few things are never and always. So we use hedging language. Now, I come back to that 7.0. So maybe a tendency to overgeneralize. So this is the way I read it. We're not using hedging language. one thing I should highlight, if we've got two parts of the question in a particular essay, I will talk about the other side. So some people would say this could be because of ABC, and they might do this otherwise. So we use lots of hedging and or more hedging in the opposing view. But when you're writing about your own opinion, I would be a little bit stronger. Okay, so I strongly believe this can rather than could. You see? So be careful about, once again, you know, try not to, you know, this will always happen, etc. Next. Something I noticed, especially a lot recently, when we write the word things, okay, you're under time pressure. And it's sometimes a little bit hard to think about what those things are. They could be products or advertisements or some reasons, for example. Once again, gain knowledge, it's fine. This is a very common phrase that I've seen a lot recently, to gain knowledge. I would just simply say it's better to teach. It can teach people to do something. And try not to use etc., a so on, and ... Okay? Remember, there should be, and try to only use 3. For example, products, advertisement, and consumers. No more, no big list. So, products and advertisements. So 2 or 3 maximum. Okay, so we get to our grammatical range and accuracy. Once again, 7 for this. Grammar and punctuation are generally well controlled. That's why if you're doing the written test with pencil, make sure they're nice and clear. Okay. For 6, complex sentences are less accurate than simple structures, but they rarely impede communication. Okay. For the last one, grammatical errors may be frequent and cause difficulty for the reader. That's also why if you should quickly read through, you can't read out because you're in a test, but read it out in your mind. Some of the stages for task 2 that I should really highlight. So in the test, okay, read the question and understand the task. Spend a minute or 2 with this and make an outline. Highlight the key parts in the test. Okay, so, you know, what it's asking you. Because that can be, once again, as I mentioned, if you just see health and write about health and you don't analyze the task, it can really reduce your task response. Decide quickly. All right? Very quickly. Answer logically, explain and make clear, and check answer. So, using once again, Pauline Collins for this, make a point, explain the point, expand, and link back to the question. This is also quite important. If you read through again later and you realize that you've not sort of gone back to the question on the written test, then try to add in underneath. So leave that gap between paragraphs. If you cannot fit it in, it's okay to put a small star and add that underneath as well. Okay. Now, you may include any relevant examples from your own knowledge or experience. So I see this quite often. Now, okay. So remember, don't invent facts. Scientists have said that the Earth will increase in temperature by 1.5 degrees by 2030. It's not an academic essay. All right. This cannot be checked. You might have heard it on the news, but we are generalizing in task 2. So instead, there is a strong possibility the Earth may continue to heat if. So we're using this is your own opinion. We're using your own knowledge as well. Also, very important, I see this so often. Don't talk about a family member, friend, or someone you know. My family experienced flooding in the north of Vietnam. All right. Instead, many people have experienced flooding in the northern areas of Vietnam. Remember, these kind of examples should be short. And once again, these are from your own knowledge, but they support the task. So, for the introduction, now remember, you don't have much time to do an introduction. The important part is the thesis status, the writer's opinion. It's okay to do a preview, but I would recommend it's a bit of a waste of time. So I won't go through the question, but here, we get a general statement. The rise in juvenile delinquency has been associated with the changing role of women in society. So we got the opposing opinion. Some may, there's our hedging or modal, argue that the rising number of working mothers is the root cause of this issue today. However, and this is your opinion if you're writing, it is far more complicated than that, as the media and peer pressure also contribute to this youth problem. So think about how to organize. You can see there are 3 sentences maximum here. You could even, under time pressure, you could just simply have the opposing view and also your point. As you can say here, I will discuss these below. This essay will discuss these below. You know, it's not necessary to say these. It doesn't really say much. The examiner knows that you will be discussing these below. All right. So it's fine to write this, but it's a little bit of it's a few wasted words. Okay, moving to the conclusion. Now, once again, it's for a very high score, you should have a conclusion. But if you're not going to finish your task 1, then jump to task 1 and then come back to conclusion if you have time. So restate the problem. It is clear that blood sports must be prohibited. I hope that the governments around the world discuss this, restate the opinion, and forbid this inhumane type of sports as soon as possible. Okay. Sometimes you have discussion essays, problem solution essays. For the reason for this, restate the problem again and restate the solutions here. And if you are under 250 words, simply add something under opinion. This should then give families the motivation for them to leave, thereby relieving overpopulated areas. Okay. Now, some of my ideas for self-improving. Many of you doing the IELTS test soon. Those who are doing the computer-based test, while you're practicing at home, remember that Microsoft Word, then when you've practiced with a particular task, then copy and paste onto Microsoft Word, and you can see your own mistakes. especially with spelling and grammar. Once you have written an essay, if you have time, leave it a day and check. If not, get a friend or a teacher, rewrite and improve. Familiarize yourself with world topics. So this is quite important. Many of you will be taking the IELTS soon. Simply look up online and see what's happening around the world. There's quite a lot happening at the moment. Some of the big topics in IELTS are obviously the environment, technology, education, and the media. These are big, big topics in IELTS as well. If you have time, okay, build up vocabulary, Cambridge Vocab for IELTS. This is a Cambridge website, IELTS and normal practice. It gives automatic feedback, which is obviously from an algorithm. And some of those Pauline Cullen videos I was talking about, there's a link for that. She mentioned some of the things I'm still learning as I go as well. And so, do you have any questions?